Hi, Year 10. We're going to move on. We're moving on to the third topic in this unit, which is dialogue, the dialogue unit, and we're beginning to look at medical ethics. Before I look at the title for this lesson, I just want to read out this example, just see what you think. There's a picture of a violinist on the screen. Here's the example. It comes from a philosopher called Judith Jarvis Thompson. See what you think. She says, imagine this situation. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Musical Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it had we known. But still, they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. By then he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Now, what Judith Jarvis Thompson is saying is, if you were in that situation, it's a very unlikely situation, but she's not saying it because she thinks it's going to happen. She's saying it to think about a different question. She's saying, if you found yourself in that situation, someone had kidnapped you and plugged a violinist's circulatory system into yours, that would mean that for the next 9 months you would have to walk around with this person next to you at all times. Unplugging him would kill him. Should you be obliged? Do you have a duty to keep him alive, or can you unplug him? That's the question. Now, Judith Jarvis Thompson is a philosopher who believes that abortion is morally acceptable. And she's using this example to say, look, in this situation, we would think, well, no, this has happened to this person against their will. If they want to, they should be able to unplug themselves and kill the violinist. Her point is that when someone's pregnant, it's exactly the same as that situation. Another living being is plugged into their circulatory system in their womb. Taking that being out would end that being's life, but her point is this: it's not that being's body, it's the woman's body. She's the one who has to carry this person around for 9 months. If she doesn't want to, she should have the freedom not to do it. So I just thought it was an interesting example to begin with, because we discussed abortion today. Now, it's interesting because a lot of people, you might have thought already that there are a few dissimilarities between this case and the case of abortion. For example, in this case, the violinist has been kidnapped. The woman has been kidnapped against her will and forced to have the violinist plugged into her system. However, in most cases of pregnancy, the woman is not forced to be pregnant. It's a result of her own actions. You could say that this was more comparable to a case where someone's pregnant due to rape, but that is a different moral issue for a lot of people than other forms of pregnancy. Other people have said to me, well, look, we don't know this violinist. We've got no relationship to this violinist. But when you unplug the person in a pregnancy, that person is your own child. They're related to you genetically. And so that might make a difference to your moral obligations. Maybe it does. So this is what we're going to look at. We'll come back to Judith Jarvis Thompson a bit later. But just highlights, I suppose, the questions that abortion raises. Because it raises really interesting issues in terms of your rights as an individual. Do people have complete right to decide what happens to their own bodies, or the rights of other people? Do we have an obligation to protect the lives of other people, even if it goes against our own interests? It's also, of course, one of the areas where religious and non-religious people clash the most in society. It's probably one of the main areas where you get big disagreement between many religious people, not all, and many non-religious people. And so that's why it's included in this dialogue section, because it's really looking at the fact that, well, here is one of the issues in which religious and non-religious people disagree in modern society. Okay, so what we're going to do is going to make notes for the beginning of the lesson based on this video, and then there's going to be a handout which I'm going to put on the Teams page with this video. that you'll be doing the later task in the lesson. So first of all, can you put this title? How do people make ethical decisions about abortion? Once we've got the title down, we'll go through a few key. Here are some key terms that you need to know. The first two at the top are key terms describing the two different positions within the abortion debate. So pro-life, people who call themselves pro-life have the belief that life is precious and that abortion is always wrong. So those are people who are against abortion. They don't call themselves against abortion, though. They call themselves pro-life. In other words, they think abortion is murder, so they're against abortion because they're for life. The other side of the debate doesn't call themselves pro-death. That would sound too negative. They call themselves pro-choice. That's because it's not like people who are for abortion or for abortion in all situations. Of course not, and no one would ever be born. They are for the woman's right to choose. So pro-choice says that it is the mother's choice to have an abortion or not, and it should be no one else but the mother's. Two other words that are important. Again, these two are linked to each other. Embryo and fetus. These are two words used to describe the child or the being that is developing in the womb. So an embryo is used for the first 9 weeks usually. So the embryo means the word used to describe the early stages of life in the womb, from conception, when the egg is fertilized by the sperm, until the 9th week. Fetus is a word used to describe the baby in the womb from the 9th week onwards. So until the 9th week, embryo, and from the 9th week onwards, fetus. So those are two words that are important. You might sometimes see fetus spelled F-E-T-U-S rather than F-O-E-T-U-S. That is American spelling. So we usually spell it in this country with an O and an E. So can you make sure you've got those 4 key terms in your notes? Okay, so the next thing to think about is this. Well, what are the questions you need to ask yourself when you're making the ethical decision about whether abortion is right or wrong? Well, really, there are 2 questions. That doesn't mean that you can answer it, that it's simple, these 2 questions. Both the questions are quite complicated, but there are 2 questions you need to answer. One, you need to decide at what point does an embryo or fetus become a living human being? In other words, at what point does abortion become the same as killing any other human being? If you think that the fetus is a human being from the very first moment, I should say the embryo, from the very moment of conception, which is what many religious people believe, then you will probably be against abortion because you're taking a human life. It's killing. If you don't think that an embryo or a fetus becomes a baby until after birth, then you probably are fine with abortion because you think, well, you're not killing a human being. Most people are somewhere in between. Usually they think that there is a point at which we have to say the embryo or fetus is now a human being. A lot of people who are not religious would say, well, at conception it's just this like blob of cells. Is that really a human being? And so they try to find some point along the way when it becomes a human being. However, that's not the only question you need to ask. The second question is this: are there any situations in which taking an innocent human life is justified? If you don't think a fetus or an embryo is a human being, then probably you're going to be for abortion. However, it's possible that you could say, some people might say that they think the fetus is a human being, yet at the same time they still think the woman has a choice about whether to keep the baby or not. For example, look at Judith Jarvis Thompson. She was basically arguing in her violinist example that in that situation she's well aware that the violinist is a human being, but she still thinks it's okay to end his life because it's a woman's free choice what happens to her body. So I would say with question 1, if you think the embryo or fetus is not a human being, then probably your decision's made. You probably accept abortion. But if you think the embryo or fetus is a human being, that still doesn't necessarily mean you're against abortion, because you might think, well, yes, obviously killing a human being is usually wrong, but you might think, well, but there are some circumstances in which we can take a human life. So you might say that some abortions are justified. So those are the 2 kind of main questions to look at. We're going to begin by looking at question 1. When does the fetus or embryo begin? And then we're going to look at the second issue, different ethical points of view about is abortion allowed. Okay, I like this image because this image shows the stages of the development of an embryo and then fetus in the womb. So, it starts at the beginning when the mother and father are friends with each other, let's say, and then the egg is fertilized by the sperm, and then it develops, and it's first just a blob of cells. Then it grows and grows and grows and grows, and you can see gradually it just gets more and more. First it looks like a little animal, and it's got little hands, and you can see gradually and gradually and gradually it becomes more and more human-like until towards the end, obviously it looks quite like a baby in the last few weeks, and then it's born. Hooray! So the question is, where along this, sorry, my slide skipped on. I don't know what that was. Where along in those pictures does it become a living human being? Now, we're going to look at this, and you need to make notes from this slide. So we're going to look at the development of the fetus, or the embryo, and look at some key dates. I want you to write the stuff on this slide down, and there might be a few things to add based on what I'm going to say in the video. So I'm going to talk about some key points in which people have believed, or do believe, that the fetus or embryo becomes a human being. Okay, the first one is 0 weeks. In other words, the point of what's called fertilization or conception. So this is the moment when the egg is fertilized by the sperm. Many Christians believe that the fetus is a living human being from this point. So many Christians who are against abortion use this as a big justification. They say, look, it's just the same as murder, because at the point of fertilization, conception, the fetus is a living human being. So we're going to try and underneath that, I want you to put down at least one of these 2 bullet points, because there's a couple of reasons why some people might doubt this idea that it's a living human being. Firstly, at this stage, the fetus is just a blob of cells. I should say embryo there. I've not been very exact here because it's an embryo at this point. It cannot think, move, or feel pain. Is this really a living person? So some people might just question it. How can you call that a living person? A bigger argument, I think, is this. If you're thinking it from a religious point of view, 70% of fertilized eggs never implant in the womb. So to develop into a baby, the egg has to implant in the womb. So this means the fetus dies a few days after fertilization. Since this is true, does it really make sense to say that life begins at conception? Why is that? What does that argument mean? Well, this argument means this. If pro-life Christians tend to say life begins at the point when the egg is fertilized, and therefore God says it's wrong for you to take the life of that baby, of that embryo, at any stage after conception. However, it seems that through natural causes, God is causing more than half, in fact a lot more than half, 70% of eggs that are fertilized to die and not to be implanted in the womb. Therefore, it seems a strange thing. God doesn't want us to kill fertilized eggs, yet God himself kills 70% of fertilized eggs. It seems to not make much sense. So that makes some people question the idea that life begins at fertilization or at conception. Just remember, it's conception, that word, where the egg and the sperm meet, not contraception. That's the opposite, really. Contraception is things that stop people, the egg and the sperm, from meeting. So it's conception. Okay, 16 to 17 weeks is the point that it's an old-fashioned term, but it's the point that people call quickening. Quickening is the point when the fetus first starts to move. So people can feel the fetus moving in the womb. The baby starts to kick and so on. Now, in the past, some Christians thought this was the moment when the fetus got its soul. So it hasn't always been. It's not every kind of Christian who has always thought that life begins at conception. Some believe that quickening was the moment, was the point when the fetus got its soul. Of course, when if you think historically, people wouldn't have known the exact point of conception because the technology wasn't developed then, and so on and so on. And although people might have been aware that they were pregnant, the first kind of tangible evidence of the baby's existence, the first time people could really notice the baby was there, would be when the baby started to move. So you can understand why historically this was of a significant importance to people, because people thought, well, they really know they're pregnant, and therefore they feel like the baby is alive from that point. So that is a point that's sometimes given for the point when the baby could be alive. You might, as a criticism, might say, well, just because that's the point when we can feel it moving, is that really the first time it's alive? Okay, next one, 24 weeks. This is the point of what's called viability. Now, this is the basis of the law in the UK. So this is the point after which you can't have an abortion, or you can't have an abortion easily. You know, you might be able to have it in an emergency situation, or if there was some threat to health. But usually in the UK, the normal cut-off limit is 24 weeks. After 24 weeks, it's much more difficult to have an abortion, whereas before 24 weeks, it's fairly straightforward to have an abortion. So, yeah, it's called viability. Why is it called that? Well, viability is the point at which a baby could usually survive outside the womb if it was born. So in other words, viability represents the point where if you had the baby at this time, if the baby was born prematurely, if it was 24 weeks old, it could survive with the medical technology we have and live outside the womb. So the idea there is to say, well, I suppose they're trying to define being alive as the point where you could exist as an independent person. You know, if you take it from the violinist example, it's the time when, if he was unplugged, yes, he might not be very wet, he might not like it, he might not be very well, but he could survive. He wouldn't necessarily die. Now, an interesting thing is that because medical technology moves on and on, the point of viability has actually become earlier and earlier because, you know, we've got more technology that can keep more prematurely born babies alive. And because of that, there were some attempts to push back the date at which abortions were allowed. Some people tried to make it 20 weeks and say we shouldn't have abortions after 20 weeks. And there was a kind of movement in Parliament to change it, but it was voted against. And so Parliament didn't change the time at which people can have abortions. So there's another point at which we might say life, a fetus becomes a living being. The last one, of course, is 40 weeks, which is birth. That's the end of the pregnancy. So some people have argued that a fetus only becomes a human with the right to life when it is born. And so some people say, well, that's the definitive cut-off point. Before that, it's just a potential human being. It hasn't been born yet. Once it's born, then it's a human being with full rights, and so on and so on. So make sure you have a list of all of those different times and why people would pick those times, and then we'll move on to the next point. Should maybe before we move on, I'll just point out, you know, UK law is that people who have an abortion, now they have to give a reason to have an abortion, but in practice, abortion is pretty much on demand in this country. So you have to have it approved by 2 doctors, and you have to give a reason. The reason why, but those reasons can be quite broad. So it could be mental health can be a reason. It could be mental health of other people in the family. It could be for physical health. But because mental health is included as a reason, that means in most situations if someone, you know, it's considered damaging to someone's mental health if they are forced to go through a pregnancy they don't want to go through with. Therefore, abortion is allowed as long as it's before 24 weeks. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Okay, this is the next bit. So we've looked at when a life begins. I want you to turn and look at the handout. So I've given you a sheet that has Christian views on abortion on one side and non-Christian views on abortion on the other. And all I want you to do with these two things, for each argument, so for each box, I want you to highlight which bit you'd use as the evidence here. And then in the box on the right hand side, I want you to think about how could you criticise this point of view. So I'll just go through these one by one and see what the evidence is. I'll try and be quick on it. The Roman Catholic view, well, they're against abortion, and they're against abortion primarily for 2 reasons. One is that, well, for 2 reasons combined, I suppose. One of the 5 purposes is to preserve life. So they're against taking life, and so they believe in preserving life. And they believe life begins at conception. So you need to have those 2 together, because being against abortion is only preserving life if you think the fetus is alive. Well, they think the fetus and the embryo is alive, and they're against preserving life. So it's all to do with natural moral law. So the bit I'd highlight is one of the 5 purposes to preserve life, and they believe life begins at conception. Just a little bit at the bottom there in the box is that they do believe, because of their teaching of the doctrine of double effect, they do believe that if you need to save the life of the mother, you can have an abortion. That's because it's a bit like the way in which Catholics justify war. The idea is that if the purpose of your action is to preserve life, which it would be if you have an abortion to save the life of the mother, you're actually doing it to preserve the mother's life. That makes taking the life acceptable, because your intention isn't to take life, your intention is to preserve life, but another life is taken as a result of that. But altogether, if you were doing just straightforward SEE on what Catholics think about abortion, they are against it. So the first bit is your evidence. How can it be criticised? Well, a conservative Protestant might criticise the Catholic view simply because they're not using the Bible. Now, that, as we'll see, conservative Protestants agree with the Catholic view, but they might say, but they're using the wrong reasons. What they should be doing is looking at what it says in the Bible, not looking at natural moral law, which is not in the Bible. Okay, conservative Protestants, nice and straightforward. They're against abortion because they think taking life is wrong, and they believe that life begins at conception. Why do they think taking life is wrong? Well, in the Ten Commandments it says, "Thou shalt not murder." You could also say, use God created mankind in His own image. For Christians, that means that human beings are special, sacred to God. How could you criticise? Well, you could. There's a number of ways. One is you could look at specific examples. And you can put quite an emotional argument forward by just saying, well, what about, and looking at examples. So liberal Christian might say, well, what about terrible situations of people are pregnant due to rape? What about terrible situations of children who will be born with horrible diseases or disabilities? Really, really, terribly life debilitating diseases. Shouldn't they be allowed in that situation? If you wanted to criticise from a more Christian point of view, you could use love your neighbour and say sometimes it's the most loving thing to do, which we'll look at next. You could also say, well, yeah, it says it's wrong to kill, and it says human beings are special in the Bible, but it doesn't say a lot about specifically abortion. Because most people agree that it's wrong to kill, but some people think it's okay to take life in the case of abortion. So you might say, well, it doesn't really address that. It gives general views on killing, but it doesn't say anything specifically about abortion. Liberal Christians. So liberal Christians use love your neighbour, that is your evidence. And they say, look, in some situations, this is what you've got to be clear on here. It doesn't mean liberal Christians think abortion is great or anything. It means that liberal Christians are very careful and say in some situations, if it's due to rape, if there's a severe disability, we're not talking about some minor disability, we're talking about some severe genetic condition where the child might be, born into incredible suffering and only have a very short life anyway. How can you criticise them? Well, picking and choosing from the Bible would be the criticism there. Okay, let's have a look at the secular arguments. So I've put two here. I put the pro-choice point of view and I've put utilitarianism. So the pro-choice argument is basically saying that women have the right to decide what happens to their own bodies. So Margaret Sanger says, no woman can call herself free who does not control her own body. That would be my evidence there. It's a really good quote. Or your evidence could be Judith Jarvis Thompson's example. So the whole point of that argument is that women have the right to control what happens to their body, therefore they have a right to have an abortion. The criticism that's usually given there is, you could just go for a religious criticism, say it's God's right to give life and take away life. That's a very Christian point of view. Or from a non-religious point of view, you might say, yeah, but hold on, if you're saying you're concentrating on the women's rights, what about the rights of the fetus? Doesn't the fetus have rights? So some people might argue you've got the full right to control what happens to your body, but some of those rights, perhaps it's right to take them away if that affects what's happening to another living being, like a fetus. So that would be the pro-choice point of view. Lastly, utilitarianism. Your evidence here is quite straightforward. It's this Jeremy Bentham quote, "The greatest happiness for the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation." And quite straightforwardly here, utilitarians would say that it's all about what brings the most happiness. So if it's going to bring the most happiness to have the abortion, then that's what you should do. And that means that they would probably, utilitarians, allow abortion for a much wider range of reasons than, say, someone who believes in just a liberal Christian would. So, for example, they'd say, look, if the child will be born with severe disability or illness, it's right to have an abortion. If the family are living in poverty and they cannot afford to support another child, obviously it would bring more happiness to people, or at least bring less suffering if the child's not born. If the mother has been raped, and the child will be a reminder of her traumatic experience. So they would be willing to see very many reasons why it's okay to have an abortion, because any situation in which it brings the most happiness they would agree with. How can you criticise utilitarianism? Well, you could say, I mean, one of the problems with utilitarianism is that it allows many actions that most people would consider wrong if it brings the most happiness. For example, I once run into a famous utilitarian called Peter Singer, and he believed that not only was abortion acceptable, but in some cases it might be infanticide might be acceptable. That is killing very young children. I mean, that's to most people that's obviously morally abhorrent, terrible thing to say. But the point is, if you use the utilitarian point of view and you're just balancing happiness, and you might say, well, yes, but if the family is very poor, and this child is going to create more poverty and more suffering for the whole family, you're just judging against getting rid of one life versus the happiness of all these other people. Now, not an argument I would think anyone would agree with, but it shows one of the problems with utilitarianism. So you could say utilitarianism could end up justifying really terrible acts if it brought more happiness to more people. That would be my criticism. Okay, that's everything really. We'll just have a look at an exam question at the end, but I don't want you to write an exam question. All abortions are moral unacceptable. This would be a good question. So this is basically saying, is it always wrong to have an abortion? And then you just go through, different points of view. You could say, Roman Catholic would agree with the situation. I don't know, would they agree? I suppose they would disagree in the sense in situations where the mother's life is at risk. But you might say something like Roman Catholics would agree that abortion is usually wrong, and then you put your evidence. Life begins at conception. One of our moral purposes is to preserve life. And then you'd say this means that they're usually against abortion, but I would include in my explanation. However, Roman Catholics do allow abortions in case where the woman's life is at risk. Then you do your criticism. Conservative Protestant would agree with the Catholic view, but would say that they're given their wrong reasons for it. That they should be focusing on the Bible and not on what natural moral law. And then next one might be liberal Christian. Liberal Christians would disagree with this. They would say in some situations abortion is okay if it's the most loving thing to do. You talk about love your neighbour. This was the teaching that Jesus said was one of the two most important commandments, was love your neighbour as yourself. This means they think that yes, in the Bible it says you can't kill, but if it's the most loving thing to do, you can break those kind of rules. Therefore, they would accept abortion in cases of the woman's been raped, the child will be born with into a great amount of suffering and pain because of some genetic condition, and so on and so on. However, they can be criticised because they're picking and choosing which parts of the Bible to follow. So that question is actually quite straightforward if you know this information that we've just been through. What we're going to do is, once we've been through the whole of medical ethics, I'll talk about a form of question that might be a bit more tricky, and that's the idea of to what degree should religion influence the laws we have in this country about medical ethics, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, that's everything for now. Thank you.